We talked about the coronavirus yesterday, many aspects of it. I got a couple of notes from people asking about I made reference to the fact that in China, after the government was fully aware of the coronavirus being loose in the town of Wuhan, actually, after they were aware that it was lethal, that it was extremely contagious, that they didn't have it under control, they didn't have a plan, the Chinese government, permitted to go forward a competition in Wuhan where they were going to have people attend the world's biggest potluck. It was intended and held for the purpose of having to breaking the Guinness Book of World Records on the largest potluck. So it was 40,000 families. So that's 40,000 families, over 120,000 people cooking at home, bringing food together, plotting all out, eating each other's food. If you were trying to spread coronavirus, you couldn't do a better job. Several people after the show emailed or put messages up saying, hey, I can't find that story. So today on AmericaCanWeTalk.org, on my website, on the homepage under shows, drop down list of links, I put the link in to a New York Times story. New York Times reported on it right when it happened, and it was early on in the coronavirus where they were saying, this doesn't seem very smart, but, we don't really know how this virus thing is going to go. It was early January, or mid-January when the story ran. And so I wanted to say two things about that. Number one, you can find the story in the New York Times link on my website. And second is, it is interesting because listeners were saying to me, hey, I Googled, I checked, I can't find this story. I want to point out why you couldn't find this story. This does not reflect well on the Chinese government, does not reflect well on the socialists who run the Communist Chinese Party. And therefore, many people in media, for a variety of reasons, some political, didn't want to run with this story, didn't want to embarrass China, but the story is there and you can read it on my website. But other extremely important follow-ups on the coronavirus. One is that yesterday we talked about the idea that the left is politicizing this. And I mean politicizing Nancy Pelosi out with some obnoxious comments immediately afterwards, trying to swoop in and take charge. And she wants to be the one. She's going to tell everybody what Congress is going to do, because she can't let President Trump be President Trump and because she has to be the center of attention. In any case, I want to tell you, though, nothing I said yesterday was intended to imply that we aren't going to have a problem here. I think we have the best healthcare system in the world. Democrats trying to destroy it through Medicare for all, but right now we have the best public health system in the world, and we are focused and doing everything we can. However, there have already been impacts in America. I want to just tell you a few of them. We talked yesterday about this China supply chain, about how too much of America's medicines are made in China. So you have a potential threat to American supply chain because China, we'll get to a moment, is pretty much shut down. When I finish telling you in a moment what's going on in China, it will cause you to realize how serious the problem is in China. But here in America, just to quickly tell you some examples of the way the supply chain is impacting America. One expression people were using was a $3.6 trillion wake-up call. We have, for example, a 9.4%, so almost 10% decline in travel agency ticketing, a 25% drop in container volumes at the Port of Los Angeles, one of the biggest ports in America, the Port of Los Angeles. 25% drop. This ultimately obviously translates into jobs and layoffs. I mean, these have consequences in the American economy. 15% of Apple's revenue, Apple the company, 15% of Apple's revenue comes from products made in China. Over 200,000 flights to and from China so far canceled. 17,600 products, different products that Procter & Gamble sells rely on products made in China. 85% of the world's toys, children's toys, made in China. Understand, we have serious impacts on the American economy. It's going to be, a possible silver lining. You never want to have a silver lining related to an epidemic, but it may cause, and it should cause, American policymakers and business leaders, industry leaders to say, hey, wait a minute, you know what? We got to get on board with America first. We got to get on board with the effort to bring more manufacturing home, where not just because we're going to have shortages as China struggles through the coronavirus, but because we want to be in charge of quality control, we want to be in charge of how medicines are made, who inspects them, who works there, how healthy are the people working there. We need to be in charge of not just medications, which are one huge arena, but computers, cell phones, all sorts of things we simply rely on every day in American life. It's a great wake-up call. There was actually a story, I think Wall Street Journal or someplace had a story about how back as far as 2015, before coronavirus was even on the scene, we had some executives inside Apple saying to the grand poobahs, the leaders of Apple, we ought to not be relying so much on just China. We ought to be maybe diversifying where we go for manufacturing. They were not ignored, maybe isn't fair. Their concern was not addressed, was not honored, and the company ignored it. But right now we're in a place, our dependence on China is coming back to bite us. I want to tell you one last story about China, just to understand how bad things are there. Before I tell you the story, the information I'm about to tell you came from an article by a guy named Charles, and he has, the middle name, he goes by Sam Faddis, Faddis. And I want to tell you about him briefly. He's a former CIA operations officer, 30 years experience in the conduct of intelligence operations in the Middle East, South Asia, and Europe. And just to understand how serious and big a player this guy was, his last assignment prior to retirement in May of 2008 was as head of the CIA's Terrorist Weapons of Mass Destruction Unit. So, serious guy, wrote an article about what life is really like in China right now because of the coronavirus. To start with, in Wuhan and probably other areas, many people live in these massive government-constructed high-rises. Think the projects in America, because government-constructed, government-assigned. So in China, where you have no freedom, people live in these massive, very high-rises, and literally having within one unit, one apartment, not just a husband and wife, but likely extended family, so they're crowded. Once this coronavirus got out of control, what was happening, and the Chinese government trying to, protect their other citizens, have quarantined these high-rises. So people living in these high-rises are not supposed to leave. They've been quarantined, forced to stay in. So they have pictures in Wuhan of people climbing down from a high level in these high-rises, the outside, I assume they're fire escape stairways, trying to get out because they need to get out. They need to get out and get food. They need to get out to get help. But they are stuck inside, stuck in these buildings, quarantined by their government, protected, of course, by their military. So these people are sneaking out at night. They had, I'm obviously not going to show it, but they had a guy trying to sneak out, high-rise, coming down the ladder and fell. So he either, died or was paralyzed. You have people, this is the way the communist mindset of the government works in China. We care about power, we care about our image, we care about keeping production going, so we're just going to force people who live in these buildings to just stay there. This is we don't care about human life, we don't value human life, we value power, we value communism, we don't care about people, so this is what's happened to them. Next story. This guy, again, this Sam Faddis, who wrote this article, again, you can find the story on my website, americacanwetalk.org, on the homepage, under shows, drop down list of links. This is a story where he's talking about what's actually happening inside China. He talks about, he had a figure in here saying 80% of the factories are shut down. They're simply not working. They can't have people coming to work who are sick, infecting others. People are afraid to go out because they don't want to be near other people who are sick. So they have this paralyzed society. They have he actually, before I get in more detail, he describes the Chinese Communist Party is not the vanguard of freedom as they're alleged to be. They're not, the society in China is not liberalizing as many in the establishment in America wanted us to believe, that China really wasn't so harsh, it's liberalizing, it's open up. No, Xi Jinping, the current leader of the Communist Party of China, is a hard-nosed communist. This is what is happening in his country. They're not liberalizing, and the people do not support their government. They simply have no way to fight back because they have no weapons, because they have no political freedom, they have no freedom of speech, they have no freedom of press, they don't even have freedom of religion. They have no freedom in communist China. So moving on, the Chinese economy is at a standstill. They talked about 80% drop in industrial activity and traffic. They also have, we talked about before in China, they have rounded up some of the Muslim population and moved them over into what you can only call concentration camps. They might call them re-education camps, but they're people pulled away from society because they're Muslim, and the Chinese government hates religion, as all communists do, hates religion, and so they've been living in they're trying to kind of, brainwash Islam out of their Muslim population in China, living in these horrific circumstances, concentration camp style circumstances. And now that the workers in Wuhan are too sick to go to work to begin manufacturing, the government is taking these Muslim, essentially prisoners, Muslim people who have been forced already once to move into concentration camps, taking them, moving them over to factories that have been shut down by the coronavirus spread, and forcing them to work in those factories. So they are trying to force people to work. They have 80,000, and the term for the Muslims who've been moved into concentration camps in China are the Uyghurs. Uighurs, the Uyghurs. They have been moved into forced working in these concentration camps. They are now talking about video coming out of Wuhan. People, the night air, it's quiet at night, and so these high rises filled, the night air sounds filled with screams of desperation as an entire city waiting to die. No one's coming to rescue them. No one's coming to help them. They talk about having incinerators working so that they are able to hide the number of people who have died from coronavirus. They're talking about incinerators capable of burning 30 bodies a day. They have 40 incinerators working 24 hours a day in Wuhan alone. I am sorry if what I told you just now is grotesque, it's upsetting. It is grotesque and upsetting, but it really is a little bit of a window on the difference between communism and freedom. The communist government, dedicated to preservation of its own power, completely not inspired in the slightest by the idea of man having the right to live in freedom, man having God-given right to live as you do in this country, to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The government is about containing the damage, hiding the damage from the world, not caring one little bit about the suffering of the people. And in fact, what this guy got around to saying, one conclusion I want to just get around to was, there was discussion about whether or not this problem in Wuhan, as it got worse and worse, is ultimately going to lead to the downfall of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're not there yet. But when you have a country desperate, hungry, no assistance coming from the government, no ability to get out and get food, there are going to be uprisings in China. They've already watched what was happening in Hong Kong, with people rebelling against the Chinese government and not wanting the repression China was trying to bring to Hong Kong. We may be in the path, and there are other experts saying this about China, we may just be in the path of finding a way out for the Chinese people out of the repression of the communist government, moving toward the idea of freedom we're so blessed to have in this country. And this is kind of tying back to my first segment in the show today. This is why so many Americans who have any sense of world history, any comprehension of what Cuba is like, what China is like, what Venezuela was like and still is, any worldliness at all, are completely disgusted, outraged by the idea that Bernie Sanders is a serious contender for president of the United States. He speaks in glowing terms about Castro. He is, although he uses the term Democrat socialist, Bernie Sanders, about himself, he is a communist. He is a guy, when he's done telling you everything he's going to do to you, to the American economy, to the producers, to the businesses, to the people who are successful in this country. This is not a guy trying to share and be loving and maybe suggest a little wider social safety net to help people in need. This is a guy with that same tyrannical mindset as many communist leaders have in China. Bernie Sanders, scary, scary guy. Even the Democrat Party is realizing we cannot have him be our candidate, so they're working to get him out of here.